In a world of major religions, of freedom of religion, of persecution, othering, the need for belonging, in a world of predators seeking positions to exploit the vulnerable, of tax-exempt luxuries and difficult legal systems, of the historical hidings of abuse in religious spaces, how can we expect almost anyone to approach law enforcement with the hopes of preventing or recovering from sexual abuse and harassment in faith-based settings? Carol M. Murchison is offering some answers to these questions, mostly to those living in America. Carol M. Murchison is a lawyer, a former partner at a large law firm, and an author involved in a long-time love affair with Mexico. She fell in love with the country's language, people, and culture during her first trip south in 1983 and moved over there in 2005. She is a keen observer, an experienced researcher, and an enthusiastic student of Mexican culture, according to her author's biography. Today, Carol will be shedding a light on the work she is involved with in seeking justice for those who have been subjected to sexual abuse and/or sexual harassment in spiritual and faith-based groups. Carol has been a speaker at this weekend's annual International Cultic Studies Association conference, and I am so delighted to have her as a guest here on the show. Hello listeners, I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, and before we jump into today's mini-series, I wanted to extend my thanks and gratitude to newest patron and supporter of the podcast, Nicole. I hope you enjoy access to the ad-free content as well as monthly deep dives into infamous cults. Also, tickets for CrimeCon UK in Glasgow on September 16th are now up for sale. Partnered with CBS Reality, CrimeCon UK is the country's biggest true crime event, and I am honoured to be a part of it. For 10% off your tickets today, you can head to crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout. And I'll see you live on stage on September 16th, 2023 in Glasgow. But for now, here is Carol M. Murchison. So hello, Carol, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming to chat with me today about your experiences and the incredible work that you do in the world. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
I would love to, and thank you for having me. So, I'm Carol Murchison. I'm a lawyer. I was a retired lawyer, but then I got involved in, I would say, investigating sexual misconduct in spiritual communities, kind of by chance. But in my prior legal life, I was an employment lawyer, and I did, among other things, investigations in the workplace into sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, all of those kinds of things. And I counseled corporations and companies on how to make the workplace better. So I'd had a little bit of experience in that. And maybe that's the background to what I'm doing right now.
Of lawyers and litigators and attorneys, there's so much lingo that is thrown around that I don't really understand that well. So I wondered if you could just explain to myself and the listeners if there's differences between those terms, and if you want to do the type of law work that you were doing, do you have to have specific training in certain areas, or can all lawyers take part in all manner of law?
Well, I guess, and it's such an interesting question because the British system is very different, right, from the American system. So I can really only talk to the American system, and I think more generally to the kind of experience and that kind of thing that lawyers have. So, what the litigation, just to give us a little bit of of a definition here, is what we call a process. It's the process of going to court and making a complaint and saying something bad happened to me, and this other person who's the defendant owes me something. They owe me some kind of duty, some kind of repair. And that litigation process has litigators. Those are the lawyers who are we kind of duke it out in place of our clients having to do that. And a litigator could be on the plaintiff side, so the plaintiff is the person who's bringing the case, who feels that they've been harmed, or a litigator could be on the defendant's side, that is the person who's saying, no, that isn't true, or no, I'm not responsible. And so for me, what I am is that I am a litigator on the plaintiff side. So I only represent people who have been harmed and who want to bring a claim. Does that make sense?
It does. And I do think that if I was ever a lawyer in a past life or in a next life, I would hope to also be on the side of helping people get justice if they
Yes.
have been harmed, as opposed to the other type of lawyer.
Well, we have lawyers should have at least a strong belief in that everyone is entitled to a defense. And so I think that for me, I have actually been on both sides. So I've been on the defense side of defending corporations. I think it's all in how you do it in a certain way. But I will say that being on the side of individuals who have been harmed is a very satisfying in lots of ways, because it's giving people voice who don't have, another alternative. So it appeals to all of those kind of underdog,
Oh, yes.
justice seeking genes.
Especially if it's individuals going up against big old destructive
Oh,
groups, which I'm sure we'll
yes.
get into as we go through our conversation. The other thing that sometimes I think gets miscommunicated in sometimes news articles and various media pieces on court cases is the difference between civil cases and federal cases. Can all lawyers work on both cases, or is it specific types again that can only work on federal cases?
Well, so let me first say that so that your listeners know that I'm really only talking about the US law, because it's I think it's even a little bit different in Canada and certainly different in the UK. But the two different, and I think this would be the same in the UK, two different kind of pathways, let's call them, of the law are criminal and civil. Okay, so um, the criminal justice system, the end result is jail. If you are convicted, well, you might get a suspended sentence, but you get found guilty of something that is a crime. And it is those litigators that we were talking about before, those people are called like crown prosecutors or district attorneys, and they work for the government. So that's the kind of outline of the criminal justice system. The civil justice system, the person who's been harmed that we're talking about, the plaintiff, has their own lawyer. So that's a person like me. And they go to a different branch of the court, and there is a defendant, and that person generally has a lawyer. And the end result of that is not jail, but it's usually some kind of recompense, some kind of reparations, generally money. And so those are the two kinds. Now, within both kinds, there are federal laws and there are state laws, just to make it more complicated, right?
I love this. This is great. I am placing, when you read about certain district attorneys having like almost a level of like infamy in the legal system, and you're wondering why is somebody so notable, but now I realize it's all kind of fitting into place. This is great.
It's helpful for people to understand the difference between the two systems, because I think what I have found, and I wonder whether you have found the same thing with the folks that you interview and your listeners, that we only think of the criminal justice system. So when I tell people, when people say to me, I went to the police. I went to the district attorney. They wouldn't take my case. Then people give up because they think that that's the only thing that's available to them. But there's a whole other part of the justice system that's based on the civil law. And by the way, it has much less of I think the pathway to a legal resolution is not an easy one, but the criminal one is particularly difficult, I think, because you don't have your own attorney, because the burden of proof is very high. When we go to put someone in jail, we want to know that they are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not the same standard in the civil justice system. And so it's often easier. They have they have their own lawyer to protect them and defend them.
Gosh, it's tricky already, isn't it? Because if you're working with individuals who have been, and I imagine in some cases severely abused and coerced, and there is an option for a criminal case because of things we talked about before we hit record, like statute of limitations.
Mm-hmm.
If there's the opportunity for a civil case with perhaps a financial payout at the end, does that always feel like justice? Because I'm not sure that it does. So I guess there's that tricky thing.
It is. It is very tricky. And you know what I have started to feel like is because I didn't always work with survivors. I worked with corporations, which is a completely different animal, obviously, but not all of the nuances were clear to me when I started doing this work. What I understand now is that I try to listen to what the survivor wants for themselves. So some survivors will say, I want to put this person in prison. And in which case, then obviously the only route is the criminal justice system. Um, Other survivors want don't want to go the criminal route because it is portrayed, and it is to a certain extent very hard on the person bringing the case. I mean, you have only to look at shows on television or in the movies to see a survivor who's sitting in a courtroom in a witness chair being torn apart by another the defendant's attorney. So it's not always a pretty sight, but for many people, the criminal justice system, for a variety of reasons, is not something that they want to pursue. And the idea of some kind of reparations for the harm that has been done to them is, it's a good thing. So, sometimes people say to me, I don't want the money. I don't want to be known as a person who did this for the money. And I have two feelings about that. One is, if you've been harmed, you deserve to be able to heal from it, and the healing takes money.
Yep.
And the second thing is that money is the currency of justice in the civil justice system. Anne Oliverius, who's the founder of the law firm that I work with in London, said that to me a couple of years ago, and I thought, that is really true, isn't it? That is a currency of justice. It is about all that we have to offer is jail or money. And neither of them are necessarily going to heal people. And so I listen to what survivors want to see what it is that will help them reach the objective of healing.
This is all incredible. I'm learning so much already, and I thrive off of like added to my own education into how these things work. So thank you so much, Carol. This is great. I'm also thinking that if a civil route is the one that's pursued and there is a monetary payout at the end, which of course can help pay for expensive therapy, if there aren't any stipulations around how the case is won or settled in terms of non-disclosure agreements or sealed records, there's also the chance that the information and all of the things that have happened in that legal suit are then available to the public as well. So even if you go down the civil route and you're thinking, what will I do with this money, there's still a chance that somebody can research, the name of the person that's had the case brought against them or has been accused of horrific things, and then see, wow, this person's been successfully sued.
Yes. Yes, and so you've raised a couple of very interesting points there. So the first one is what is called an NDA, or a non-disclosure agreement. So in past years, non-disclosure agreements were almost universally done. So what that means is that if you sue a person, let's say, because we're talking about cult leaders, we sue a cult leader because that person sexually assaulted someone and there is a monetary payout. It used to be that there would almost always be a non-disclosure agreement, which would prevent the parties to it, that is the plaintiff and the defendant, from talking about it. Now, maybe since Harvey Weinstein, maybe since 2017 and the Me Too movement, we've seen a number of cases in which people do not want to sign a non-disclosure. And it's interesting that you followed up our prior conversation about what the survivor wants with this, because sometimes the survivor says, I want to talk about it. I want to tell people what happened to me. And, my own personal feeling is that the non-disclosure agreement should be not permitted as against public policy, because if we have a group of people who are assaulting other people under the guise of religion, then we all need to know about that to protect ourselves, our sisters, our brothers, our children, our neighbors. But that's not the case yet. However, a non-disclosure is not required. It makes it harder sometimes to settle cases because obviously the people who are giving out the money don't want people to know about what they've done. But I will also tell your listeners that in a lot of cases, court records are public records. You can go, unless they've been sealed by the judge, which is usually done only if it's a minor, you can go and look up the case. Also, a non-disclosure agreement does not prevent other people from talking about it. And so it doesn't prevent your mother, your sister, your brother, your father, well, whoever who knows about what happened to you from speaking.
Gosh,
There
that's
are
a
other
big
things.
old loophole, isn't it? It's
Yes, it
like,
is.
I've signed a non-disclosure form, but I'm going to sit down with you. I'm going to tell you my whole story, and then you can tell it to other people.
Well, I think that the way that it would be legitimately is that you told other people before you were bound by the non-disclosure agreement. Right. So you don't want to sign the non-disclosure and then go around telling people, because that would be violating the non-disclosure. Now, there's an open question about what could be done about that, but presumably there is a legal option for the defendant. But I'm talking about in the course of the litigation, in the course of what has happened to you, you've told a lot of other people, they are not necessarily bound by that agreement. So the non-disclosure agreement, well, so you said an interesting thing in there, which a lot of survivors say to me, which is, as I said, the kind of, all I'm going to get is money and I don't want the money. And what I tell people is, you can do anything you want to with the money. You could give the money back to them the next day if you wanted to. It's your money. And generally speaking, when people get to that point, they do find that the money doesn't the money never compensates for what's happened to people, but it makes, as you said, expensive therapy and other healing things possible. It makes life somewhat easier. And so I encourage people by saying, you can decide what it is that you want to do with that money. And if you still feel like you didn't want the money and you want to give it back to them the next day, I'm guessing not a lot of people feel that way by the time that they've been through the process, but it's a possibility. It's yours. And I think that's something that's very satisfying for survivors about the end, coming to the end of a legal process like the civil justice system, is that it belongs to you. You have taken back your voice. You have taken back the power that was taken away from you. And that is more important, I think, in the end, than the money. The money's like a byproduct of that.
I think of Dan Shaw during this conversation and
Oh,
his
I
work
love
around
Dan Shaw.
traumatic.
I love
Sorry,
Dan Shaw.
I imagine thinking about his work around traumatic narcissism and how it must feel for individuals who are told that they have to give
Yes.
something to the people that they have abused. Oh gosh, it must make them want to tear their insides out, I imagine.
I imagine that it does. And I have to say that I feel okay about that.
Yep.
You know, I mean, it's a very interesting point, isn't it? That it isn't one-sided. So the giving of the money, the being through the civil justice system is a way of bringing to the perpetrator the consequences of their actions in a very real way. I know you have young children, and so that, as parents, we're always trying to find the way to communicate with our children that you can do certain things, but then you have to deal with the consequences of your actions. And cult leaders do not ever have to deal with the consequences of their actions unless we can go through a system like the civil justice system or the criminal justice system.
With a civil case, would individuals still be given the opportunity to read out victim impact statements?
Yes, absolutely. Sure.
I
Absolutely.
think that must be a big thing for an individual who has experienced trauma and abuse to stand up in a place where they have to be listened to. The
Yes.
defendant has no choice but to listen to what their victims have to say about what's happened to them.
And the thing is also, and this is a frightening thing for survivors, quite frankly, but also you get to tell your story under oath, sitting in the same room. That's a frightening part. But litigation doesn't happen overnight. In fact, it happens over way too many nights because it's a long, drawn out process. But in many ways, I feel that that is an advantage for survivors because they're healing also day by day. And I tell my clients, your future self is going to be able to deal with this. It's going to be able to deal with being in the same room and telling your story and having it be heard.
Oh, it's really powerful stuff. It's amazing. You mentioned that your earlier work included working with corporations around the subject of sexual misconduct. So, in terms of that phrase, can you give us what the term means and also how the term has changed over time? Because at this point in your career, I imagine you've seen different laws, different things be brought in around, maybe you remember a time where there wasn't even anything in place around sexual misconduct in workplaces.
Oh, I do. I absolutely do. I will tell you that um, in the United States, again, in 1964, Congress passed what they call the Civil Rights Act, which protected people from discrimination on the basis of many protected characteristics. Well, it ended up being many, but race and gender. eventually age. Religion was one of the original ones. Disability has been added. And then it began to be expanded to include not just discriminating against people, like not giving them a job because of their race or their gender, but harassing them in the workplace. And so that evolved from 1964 until, I think, in the United States in 1986, the Supreme Court decided the first case in which they said it's not okay for a manager to have sex with an employee because they need the job and you can never tell whether it was consensual. That was in 86. And so then in the early 1990s, we began to see a kind of an explosion of cases that had to do with harassment because of a televised hearings of Anita Hill versus Clarence Thomas, which Americans may know, but it was about this the confirmation hearings of a Supreme Court justice who was accused by a woman of sexually harassing her in the workplace. And at that point, I think it was in the early 90s, let's say, all of that exploded. And so, yes, I have seen a tremendous, arc of movement in this area from being it's okay to do this to women or men, but the majority of the sexual harassment cases are women, but the law is gender neutral. And so it could be either. And to see that move on along then from the late 90s, when many corporations, and your listeners who work for companies will recognize this, where we began to have a policy in place that says this is what you cannot do. And if this happens to you, then this is how you deal with it. It's the kind of HR policy on sexual harassment and discrimination. And we've seen that evolve over time from being something like a lot of the early cases, very crude things. Women who went to work in all male industries and were harassed. They were called names. They were touched inappropriately, all of those things. Until now, we're aware of even more subtle kinds of harassment that we don't permit in the workplace. And I think the kind of second phase of that has come about since 2017 with Harvey Weinstein and the kind of a public awareness of the fact. I tell people, and this always comes as a kind of a shock. When I speak with oftentimes Buddhist organizations, I tell them that corporate America is doing a better job on this than Buddhist America. And that is a shocking statement, right? But they are. They're not, it's not because they're better people. It's because they're clear about what the law is and what their responsibilities are. And so many of these religious organizations that are crossing the line don't know that.
You've seen so much change and shift around harassment in the workplace, sexual misconduct in the workplace, and you mentioned that typically those cases is sexual harassment against women. And I was thinking about a conversation that I had the other day with Evan Stark, and he was talking about how women will always be at risk of domestic violence, of sexual harassment until there are equal rights for everyone. Otherwise, there's a power imbalance. And as soon as you have a power imbalance, you're talking then about the manager and the employee scenario.
Yes.
It could be a husband and wife in the house. If there is a power imbalance in terms of the man goes out to make the money because there are not equal opportunities for the woman to go out and do that, then already there's a power imbalance on so many different levels. And it's, again, until we have equal rights for people, we are not going to see the end of coercive control of women, whether it's at home, in the workplace, in religious groups, in cults. And I wonder how it feels for you being a woman to see this shift in the women's rights movement that has been happening since sort of the 70s?
I think it's phenomenal. I remember some years ago I also did sexual harassment training in a lot of different environments, and I was doing a training in a hospital for doctors. And a lot of the doctors my own age were they were quite offended at the what they considered to be the sensitivity, the overly sensitive younger female doctors, and to some extent male doctors who supported them. And I see that as just such a tremendous advance for us, that younger women and younger men are not willing to put up with a lot of the well, I was going to use a swear word, but you could fill in the blank there, that those of us who have been through all of these wars have had to put up with. It's tremendously encouraging to me that that the that younger women and men are saying, we're here to work. And I would say the same thing about cults. The thing is that religion should be a positive thing in people's lives. And when you were talking about the abuse of power and the power imbalance, I was thinking about the fact that, to me, that is the one major marker that's like number one on my list of things that mark a cult. Because lots of times people will say, and I'm sure you get this question too, Casey, what is a cult? And sometimes people will say, well, to me, well, Christianity is a cult. Well, I suppose it depends, but rather than try to decide what the definition of a cult is, I look at what I see as the markers of what makes a cult-like organization, right? And the number one thing is power, abuse of power, a leader who cannot be questioned, a leader who is never wrong, a leader who knows what is good for you more than you know what is good for yourself. And there are many more, but that power imbalance, I think, is at the heart of what makes a cult a cult.
I completely agree, 100%. And I wrote down a quote that you said earlier, that in 1986, things really changed in terms of recognizing harassment in the workplace. Then you said, they need a job and you can never tell if it's consensual. And that's where the power imbalance is between managers and employees, for example. But you could just change the word job. They need a community. They need a
Yes.
family. They need,
Yes.
you could put anything in that sentence and it would have the same outcome. They need an X, and you can never tell if it's consensual. So as soon as there is that power imbalance, wherever it happens, there's
Yes.
the opportunity for exploitation. And yeah, so I mean, it's so interesting that you found this specific niche to work in, and we were talking about it before we hit the record button, because you asked me how I started the podcast, and I said, I don't know how I got here, but here I am. And you said, I'm the same boat.
Yes, I'm in exactly the same boat. And I think that it's so important that people understand these markers so that they can identify them. What I see, and I'm sure you do too, is that people come out of some of these organizations, spiritual communities, they've been harmed, they've been wounded, and that if we did a better job of raising awareness, which is why your work is so important, that people that at some point somebody would say, wait a minute, somebody is telling me that they have the truth, the way, the enlightenment, they're holding that, and that they know better than me what is good for me. And the way this manifests in my world is that somebody, and this happens all the time, will say, you need to have sex with me because this will put you further along the path to your spiritual on your spiritual path, or to enlightenment, or just because I feel that this is what you need to overcome the dark places in your soul. These are all things in which someone else is substituting their judgment for that person's. And I wish that we had so much awareness that when that happens, some voice in people's head would say, wait a minute, maybe this isn't right. But in cults, as you know, people are isolated often from their families, from other people. They're not going out to coffee with a friend that they had from high school. And when they tell them this, that friend says to them, hey, that sounds crazy to me. They don't get that input from the outside that we all get on a daily basis when we talk to our friends and our family, and they say to us, well, gee, that sounds like a crazy idea, Mom. I don't know why you'd want to do that. They don't get that, because they're isolated. They have been sucked in hook, line, and sinker.
I think about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh when you mentioned I need you to have sex with me, or I think you should have sex with me to reach enlightenment. And I think about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, also known as Osho. I just rolled my eyes. I mean, no one can see me
Yes,
rolling my eyes, but anyone that listens to the show will know exactly how I feel about
it was an
Osho.
eye roll
In
there.
yeah, Osho in pop culture is one of I will die on that hill.
Yeah.
But it only came to light recently. Everyone thought that this person, who was supposedly an enlightened being, was celibate. But it's only come to light recently that the inner circle of women that he kept around himself, he coerced into having sex with him under the guise of, I can only keep my enlightenment if I channel your energy through sex. So it it doesn't it's the same tactic, and it's basically the same saying the same thing, just using
It
slightly
is.
different words.
Yeah, that's right. It's saying your duty is to help me, which is,
Yep.
just a flip of the my duty is to help you. It's
Yep.
the same thing. And it's so interesting. You've used the word coercion a number of times, and I don't want to forget to talk about how coercion plays out in at least US law in terms of the human trafficking laws, which is what we've been, experimenting with, I would say, and not the only ones, certainly, but in using human trafficking as a way of bringing some accountability to these folks.
I'm thinking of several cases off the top of my head where people have been found guilty of human trafficking. So yeah,
Yes.
absolutely can see that's going to be another very interesting conversation. Um, there's so many people I think of. I did an episode last month, an exclusive episode where I talked about Lou Castro and Angel's Landing, and I was just doing my research, learning how Daniel Perez, also known as Lou Castro, managed to convince people that he had three angels possessing him that gave him supernatural abilities. And in
Mm.
order for him to maintain his health, he needed to have sex with the children. So there was lengthy grooming that took place, and young girls children, I mean, shouldn't even say underage girls, children grew up thinking that it was again their duty to permit this man to
Yes.
keep his supernatural abilities. And again, it's him saying, just as Bhagwan did, if If you don't help me, I can't help you. If I'm not enlightened, you can't become enlightened. If I don't have these supernatural abilities, then I can't predict your death or prevent your death or any other manner of wild claims that this man made, who is now in prison and will not be eligible for parole until he is 120 years old. You'll all be very happy to know.
I'm saying hallelujah.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini series on seeking justice in faith-based groups from sexual abuse and or sexual harassment with Carol M. Murchison. For more information on Carol and her work, you can check out the links in the episode description. And to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.